How are you, everybody? Welcome to Hump Day, Hump Night, with your biggest hump. I originally had this scheduled, and then I took it off the docket because I was in excruciating pain. I fell asleep. I had to teach today. It was the first time teaching since the operation. I think I did too much, wasn't moving around, just did too much, and I haven't been sleeping well, so I was very tired and fell out about 5 p.m., woke up about 8:30 and said, no, I'll do this tomorrow. I changed it. And then I said, you know what? Now I'm awake. I had a cup and what the heck? I'm here. So I hope you're all doing well. Why was the 60s so different? Now I have my own reasoning. Doesn't have to be right, but I have my own reasoning. Why was the late 60s so different than the early 60s? Well, I'll give you an example. 1961. Hello, Mary Lou, Ricky Nelson. Chuck Berry, You Never Can Tell, great song. The Marvelettes, the Beatles actually did Please Mr. Postman 2 years after the Marvelettes. They covered it. Sam Cooke, Skeeter Davis. On the other hand, move up a couple of years. Strawberry Fields, Painted Black, Good Vibrations, Born to Be Wild, Don't Sleep in the Subway, Petula Clark. Tomorrow Never Knows was a couple of years after You Never Can Tell by Chuck Berry. 2 years after Can't Buy Me Love. Why did the music change so much? Because the early 60s music sounded more like the 50s music. Really didn't change. Just the technical advance, the technology changed. The advancement in production techniques was a key, I think. I also think the explosion of drugs in the 60s counterculture. LSD was mind altering, was being used by artists and audiences alike. People were tripping out listening to the stuff that people were tripping out while they were writing it. Sergeant Pepper is one of the most important works of art in modern history if you're talking about music. It's really for music for people that are laying around stoned, and most people in 67 were. I think LSD made the artist's creativity explode. Now, the early 60s still sounded like classic 50s Elvis, Chuck Berry. There was also no British invasion because of bands like the Kinks and the Who. Late 60s sounds a lot heavier and harder. In the mid 60s, when you turned 19, you were subject to a draft. And without a deferment, you were most likely headed to Vietnam. That changes your outlook on life. And I would think you mostly live for the moment. You don't worry about tomorrow because you're not sure of tomorrow, right? Uh, the popular music brought out emotions and feelings, and the artists fed on it, especially the British invasion. Much of this emotion fed into the distrust of the government and the practice of sending young men into battle that weren't even allowed to vote. You can't vote, but you can carry a gun and shoot. And racial tensions were at the breaking point all over America. Blackbird, Paul McCartney, his ode to the civil rights movement and young black women in America. They call women birds in England. And the drug culture over time evolved primarily from returning from Vietnam because vets were being introduced to pot while overseas, and they introduced it here. So you had a lot of non vets that came back and introduced it to a lot of people that hadn't been there. Music was an escape for all the shit, and the young embraced it. Now, the technological, I have such a brain freeze with that word. Technological, intellectual, and economic factors were a great deal as well. Um, in the studio, they went from 2-track tape or even wire recording, 4 to 8 tracks, and were able to do a lot more in terms of arrangements and overdubs. Probably most importantly, allowed each instrument to be recorded individually instead of simultaneously. Say that word I could say. Also, in the late 50s, radio broadcasting companies invested in FM stations that could carry stereo instead of monophonic, mono, like AM. So it allowed the stereo to play the way it's intended to be listened to through the studio. FM stations became more common as the 60s progressed. Many times the Beatles would cut a tune and then listen to it on a transistor radio. They'd wire it up because they wanted to see how it would sound, because most people, young kids, were listening to it on the beach or in their cars. They wanted to see how it would sound through a not so developed sound system. Distortion pedals in the early 60s changed what instruments could sound like and gave the musicians control. Distorted music weren't attributed to accidents anymore. Like I Feel Fine, where where Lennon put his electric acoustic up against an amp and the feedback made that sound. And the popularity of the Beatles and Dylan, the albums were selling so fast. They were supplanting singles, and music started being purchased a different way. Rubber Soul really defined the album era. Most albums reminded me of that first Huey Lewis album where you had like 8 different hits. The album didn't flow, everything sounded different, but they were hits. Most of the time, albums were hits, not a congruent message. Pop songs weren't limited to 3.5 minutes anymore, the standard. Generally under 3 minutes on AM. Rock and roll production became the focus of major labels. So most skilled engineers and producers were working on rock records instead of jazz or classical because the money was in rock. So you're going to go where the money trail is. And drugs. Studio access for the biggest bands. The Beatles pretty much had Abbey Road #2 studio anytime they wanted. A couple of times when they went to Trident was because it was booked. The Beatles just couldn't throw someone out of there. So that's when they went to Trident and they went to Olympic a couple of times. You could spend a lot more time messing around without having to worry about going over schedule. If they didn't have the money for studio time, Beatles didn't have to worry about it. They were the biggest producer of income for EMI. EMI Britain, not as much America. And the instrumentation and the 4-track. In fact, I think Trident had 8-track. Abbey Road only had 4-track. The Beatles went and recorded a song, I forget which one it was, because of that. And they were mad because the Beach Boys stuff was sounding so crisp because they were capital in America. The studios were geared a little more toward production values. They were a little ahead of England at that time. Then there were also very accomplished rock session musicians that could be called in to help finish records. George Harrison always thought the Hollies sounded like a studio band thrown together. I never thought that. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing because Toto were studio musicians and they sound pretty tight. Eastern mysticism opened bands up to a lot of instruments and playing techniques. George Harrison had to call in Eric Clapton to do a solo from While My Guitar Gently Weeps because his own technique had suffered from concentrating on the sitar. He had been so immersed at that time in the sitar, he kind of lost his way a bit on the electric. That's why he called Clapton in. Really, the greatest increase in quality, early 60s from the 50s fluff, and the 60s had some of the greatest music ever, right? I always thought decades take 2 years to get going. Look at 1981, 82. It's much like late 79 punk, right? Squeeze, the Police, and all that. Then you get your footing, and then you had the second British invasion of 83, Culture Club, and all that. It takes a little time to settle in. The early 60s was transitioning in from the late 50s. The evils of rock and roll built off the foundations of jazz and blues, which were popular in the 50s. By the end of the 60s, rock and roll had taken over the industry. You didn't hear about blues unless you were listening to the Stones, who were into blues. And decades are pretty arbitrary in the way they divide time. There's no reason to expect musical styles just because a decade rolls over, right? It shouldn't surprise people that early 60s music sounds more like late 50s music than late 60s music. It's only a couple of years. Just because 1960, okay, we're done with the 50s, not necessarily. I don't think the change from the 60s to late 60s was unusual. Look at the top singles of the 50s. Early 50s was mostly what we think of 40s music, right? In 54, what was it? Doris Day, Perry Como, Joe Stafford, Rosemary Clooney. 2 years later, Elvis was dominating, right? The 70s were dominated. The 70s was so unsure of itself. You went from yacht rock, elevator music, to disco, to punk in an 8-year period. The early 70s were soft rock, saturated. America, Seals and Crofts, England Dan, right? Bread. Then you had the Bee Gees and Dan Hartman and all that. And then by 77, you had Sultans of Swing, the Police, Joe Jackson, Elvis Costello. Now, I don't think there is a big difference between the early and late 80s. I think music in 83, look at Flashdance, Irene Cara's song, and Michael Sembello's Maniac. They had that typical 80s sound, and that ended around 91 when you had the grunge and the Seattle stuff come in, Nirvana. But I just think that there were so many bands that were so pivotal, and it was characterized by radical shifts in genre, artistic expression. People weren't afraid to say what they felt. Artists were talking. The Beatles in the early 60s didn't comment on the Vietnam War. Now Lennon was doing Revolution, right? 66, 65, George Harrison is bitching about taxes, Taxman. And you had a lot of catalysts and so much wonderful talent. Prior to the 60s, there was mainstream music, and it was dominated by crooners, both women and men. Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, sophisticated, standardized sound that you'd hear at dinner parties and in your parents' house, because you still lived there if you were a kid. And they had a significant market share. The mid-50s, the rise of rock and roll, Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Elvis. It was a seismic shift. And it was solely driven by music style. Cultural norms, the rise of youth culture, the raw energy. It resonated in that generation. The simple, powerful chord progressions because of instrumentation, amplified instruments, Dave Davies of the Kinks taking a razor blade to get that distorted sound originally and going through the woofer in the speaker. So it was a stark different than the orchestrated stuff that were out a couple of years before, right? Look at traditional pop, let's say mid 50s, orchestral acoustic, instrumentation. You had youth rebellion, cause, and dating, romance, established norms, lyrical themes, polished, refined vocal style, energy, raw, right? Jerry Lee Lewis. Production style, relatively simple. And target audiences went from broad to all ages to primary youth. The shift in audience, coupled with the affordability and accessibility of electric guitars as well. Equipment went down. Drums were very expensive in the 50s and 60s. That's why you couldn't find a drummer. But the 60s was a distinct cultural sound. Okay, folk rock, down in the village, very big. Peter Tork, all those people. Bob Dylan, Johnny Rivers, the Byrds, Sebastian, represented a fusion of traditional folk music, lyrical depth, social commentary. Look at Dylan, amplified instrumentation, a rhythmic drive of rock and roll in a key signature that warranted dancing. And it was key to the genre. The adoption of electric guitars allowed folk music, musicians to reach larger audiences with sonic textures that they could only dream about but couldn't play it on the acoustic. Look, Dylan transformed from sold out from acoustic to electric at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, and they booed him, marked the turning point. Then you had the British invasion, of course, the Beatles, Stones, Kinks. The American music scene was triggered by a phenomenon that no one could understand, but everyone knew what it was. American blues, rock and roll, British sensibilities, quirky hairstyles, To Serve With Love, Lulu, right? England was big. Their impact was fashion and hairstyles. The culture alone, everyone knew what Abbey Road was. Close miking, tape loops were used. Studio production values had come tenfold. And then the R&B. You never heard of R&B until Aretha Franklin and James Brown, Otis Redding, raw, emotional black music to the forefront of popular culture. Soul music was gospel infused, driving rhythms, socially conscious. Civil rights movement was really geared for that. Horn sections with tight rhythmic grooves became the hallmark of that genre. Stax Records in Memphis played a crucial role in the development and popularization of soul music. Portable speakers came out. That was big. And you had stuff coming out like the wah wah pedal, thick distorted fuzz pedal, which gives you a distorted, a thick sound, a tape delay echo, reverse tape effects, and all that. But it was counterculture. It was the rise of progressive rock. The counterculture movement of the 60s fueled the anti-war sentiment and civil rights activism. It embraced alternative lifestyles. You, in the 1960s, a teenager could be anything. Profoundly impacted the musical landscape, and kids thought now for themselves. For the first time, the doors were open. You didn't have to follow mommy and daddy. Progressive emerged. It was a reaction to the limitations artists thought that mainstream rock inhibited. Couldn't let certain things out. Intellectual and artistic aspirations, art meeting rock and roll. much like the Beatles did with Sgt. Pepper years before. Floyd, Crimson, yes. Complex arrangements, extended song structures like jams, conceptual themes. Albums were treated as an artistic statement, philosophical, political, science fiction themes. Departure from a traditional verse chorus structure of pop music demanded a high level of musicianship. You had to know how to play it. Willingness to experiment, unconventional instrumentation, time signatures, which were crazy. Um, Synthesizers. The Mellotron was used in Sgt. Pepper. An early sampler, like the Moog synthesizer. You could put something and play one note, and it delayed and it looped. Progressive rock used it. It was like a sonic palette, the creation of textures, soundscapes, and it just shattered. The 60s shattered music boundaries, experimental avant garde music, free improvisation. Look at Johnny Coltrane, Archie Shepp, Ornette Coleman. Traditional notions of harmony and rhythm were thrown away with freeform improvisation, jazz musicians, spontaneous interaction, electronic music, Pierre Henry Stockhausen, which Paul McCartney looked into very much, Stockhausen, Carlene Stockhausen, the possibilities of electronic sound, manipulation using synthesizers, tape record, much like the wall of sound that Phil Spector came up with, layer upon layer. Electronic devices used as a landscape instead of a guitar or a drum pattern. Exploring inherent properties of sound itself. What is sound opposed to making it? Let's understand what it is first. Avant-garde, Zappa, Captain Beefheart, the Residents pushed the boundaries of rock, incorporating elements of jazz and classical and experimental. Zappa was known for satirical lyrics, complex arrangements. He embraced the constructed sounds. And the 60s just was something that no one could understand in the beginning, but everyone liked. And the multi-track recording. The technology represented a paradigm shift in music production. Previously, recordings were made live with all the musicians performing simultaneously. Multi-track recording allowed for layering and overdub, direct inject. If you made a mistake, put something back in. Lush arrangements, new textures. Les Paul, early experiments of multi-tracking, paved the way for studios. The 4-track, the 8-track, eventually the 16th track became standard tools in recording studios. And it changed the way you listened to music. It changed the way you made music. And it certainly changed the way music was presented. Effects processors, reverb, delay, distortion came out. Echo back in the day with Lennon, you would just sing twice and one would be slowed down a bit. Just a tiny bit, it would be slowed down. So it would layer one voice, and the delayed voice that was slowed down came out like an echo. Fuzz pedals, overdriven amps. It added aggression to guitar tones that normally were pretty clean. And then the keyboards, Moog synthesizer, Hammond organ in the late 60s. The Moog was, and it's pronounced Moog, not Moog. It's a modular analog synthesizer, a wide range of electronic sounds from soaring melodies to pulsating bass lines. The Hammond was a drawbar system, and the Leslie speaker became a staple of roll and R&B. Multi-track recording, perfect. Sgt. Pepper's, layering and overdubbing, reverb. Beach Boys used a lot of reverb. Fuzz pedal, the Stones, Satisfaction. Moog synthesizer, the Doors, electric sounds. Hammond, Bucatini and G's used the Hammond a lot. So the 60s was really a period of unparalleled musical innovation, the confluence of technological, advancements, cultural shifts. Kids didn't want to be their parents anymore. and they found something that they could throw in their faces that was actually not too bad. Danae, no, that word doesn't like me, and I used to be able to say it. Hey, BJ. Yeah, well, now you could cherry pick, BJ. You don't have to have an album out anymore. You grab the song you like. But much different music now. Much different. Now, Squeeze is coming out with a new two new albums. Trixie's was something that was written in the mid 70s, almost like a conceptual rock opera. The problem was that Tilbrook couldn't teach everyone how to play it. They weren't all that good musically at that time. They found the cassette tapes, so they re-recorded everything, and it's called Trixie's. And a second album of all new music that they have worked on for the last 2 years. Two albums are going to be released. March 6th, I believe, is Trixie's. But albums, Rolling Stone, well, Rubber Soul was the first real album that you can listen to. And even that, though, they screwed it up, but Run for Your Life didn't belong on that album. And in fact, during Revolver, Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out were part of those sessions. But the Beatles always released two different singles that were never on albums because they felt they didn't want to screw you over. But very interesting. Now, I'll let you hear the new Squeeze song.
There's a door behind the stage that leads down to a cellar. The waiter will take your coat, but nothing has ever changed. It's not for the better. The curry will swim and choke. The band are watching another fight. The heroin rushes a day and night. And the naked dancers all dressed in white. I can tell you it's out there. Miss November, she's a playmate. Rock stars of the 80s.
See if I can get away with it without getting in trouble here. And then one that was just released today, off that same album that'll be coming out. Tilbrook sounds very young. I don't think it's processed, but it's pretty interesting.
Nobody knows her real name. They call her Lucy Bourbon. She sings those melodies, I'm sure that you may know them. A Broadway song to fall in love, the blues when you have had enough. She's just the one for having fun. You get the feeling, you know you might be dreaming. Nobody is leaving. Whisper in my ear, I love the feeling here.
It's interesting. So the 1960s, for me, I always thought the Kinks got thrown out of America and couldn't come for 2 or 3 years, late 60s, because of a problem at a concert in America. And I think that hurt them. They missed a very crucial time to get big in America. Kinks were actually very good. Why are you sorry, Danae? Oh, about the arm? Yeah, it was a little hurting today, boy. So the '60s, you're never going to hear music like it again. They won't allow it. They won't allow it. You know, I always thought in the '80s was great because now a day you take a big pot and you throw in the ingredients, you stir it up, and out comes Grande and Avril Lavigne, all these people. Back then, you could be who you wanted to be. Boy George, his counterpart, Cyndi Lauper. You had Grace Jones. If anyone ever wanted proof that people from other planets live on Earth, you had Madonna, your second British invasion. Um, you could be who you wanted to be. Now you can't. Nowadays, producers will produce music that they would never play at home, but they know you'll buy it. I don't know how good that is. But like BJ said, albums don't exist anymore. Singles do. So we reverted back to the early '60s when singles were where it was at. There were some artists that I would like to have heard now in their prime with the technological advances you have now. Um, Beatles. The thing with the Beatles, I'm afraid the Beatles would overproduce. See, overproduction is not good either. That's why a lot of '80s albums don't stand up well. They're all overly produced. First of all, you have electronic drum machines that are too loud. They're not produced well. Everything's in your face. And then you have underproduced. I'll give you a perfect underproduced song where the vocals are buried. I don't know if it's on purpose, but this is a song that the production is over, not over the top. But I guess he wanted it that way. His voice is second.
Imagine there's no heaven. Sees if you try.
Sparse. And I think because after all the high production values and all the looping and everything that McCartney wanted to do, I think that John went simple. He wanted it simple again. That's why the McCartney album was so bare minimum. They got back to basics. Let It Be was supposed to be back to basics. No overdubbing. That's why on I think The Long and Winding Road, John Lennon's playing bass on that. There was no overdubbing. And then Lennon insisted on no overdubbing, and then Phil Spector gets a hold of it, and all they did was overdub it. That's why McCartney was so mad. But you look at some of the albums, Quadrophenia was incredible. The Who stuff was, I would like to hear it now. Not remastered, reissued. No, recorded now with them as 25-year-olds again. Because some of the music is just incredible. Really, what you can do now. The problem with the music of today is there is so much available to you that you're so tempted to overdo it. It looks like NASA space control room, the studio. I've been in it. We recorded, me and my friend in Virginia, Sheryl Crow's studio, and I have pictures of me in the studio, and you see so much you want to take advantage of all that, especially with the prices you're paying to be in there, $300 an hour. But I'll show you some of the pictures in the studio. Good shots. Let's see if I can find it. Virginia. Nice studio. Roger Waters goes there. Sheryl Crow. She lives in Virginia. It's near Springfield. Great studio. The engineer was real nice. The engineer, the guy ended up going to work in LA. I'll find it for you. It's actually pretty cool. Let's see. But hey, I was so tired after working today. I think it was just from not sleeping. Here is some. Here's me with the engineer. He just wants me to run through, get the sound down.
All right, we're in the sound room. Paulie's in Studio A doing the soundtrack. We're in Studio D. And that's our engineer. So we're ready to go. Actually, so you'll be in the time.
Yeah, that was November 15, 2017. Yeah, I enjoy it. So the 60s. There'll never be another decade. And in fact, I just watched To Sir with Love. What a great movie. Sir! What a tremendous movie. And then, of course, they had to ruin it because he comes back like 30 years later for a money grab. But it was a good movie. Really was. Lulu was good in that. So, everyone, thank you so much for coming in. The 60s, big part of our culture, big part of anyone's culture, whether you live through it or not, because it's where a lot of this all started. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you so much for your warm wishes. Are you, Danae? And thank you. I got a couple of cash apps yesterday. Thank you so much. It really makes me feel like I'm doing something that you're enjoying. I really do appreciate that. It's so nice of you. So I will see you tomorrow. Be well, everybody. God bless you all. Love you.